The silence in this house is not empty. It is heavy. It presses against your eardrums, a physical weight that feels less like tranquility and more like the held breath of a predator waiting to strike. I stood at the far end of the East Wing corridor, the part of the estate that the staff avoids, where the shadows seem to stretch longer and the air always feels 10 degrees colder. Before me loomed the nursery door. Solid English oak, darkened by a century of varnish, standing like a sentry against my own memories. Downstairs, the grandfather clock in the foyer began to chime. 1, 2. The sound reverberated through the floorboards, climbing the spine of the house. It sounded less like a mechanism and more like a slow, dying heartbeat. Thud-thud, thud-thud. It was the only thing marking the passage of time in a house that felt frozen in it. I shouldn't have been there. My husband, Elias, had been explicit. Forbidden was the word he used, a word that rolled off his tongue with the finality of a judge's gavel. He told me that sealing the room was an act of mercy. He told me that looking inside, seeing the empty space where our daughter, Clara, had taken her last breath 3 years ago, would break my mind. He spoke to me as if I were made of porcelain, liable to shatter at the slightest tremor of reality. But grief is not a fragility, it is a callous. I have grown hard in the silence. My hand was clenched so tightly in the pocket of my cardigan that my knuckles ached. Inside my fist, the metal bit into my palm. It was a heavy, iron skeleton key, cold and jagged. I had found it quite by accident, or perhaps by fate, tucked deep into the lining of Elias' heavy wool winter coat while I was searching for a dry cleaning receipt. He never carried keys. He had staff for doors, yet there it was, secreted away like a shameful secret. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and old, settled dust, the scent of a museum or a mausoleum. It was the smell of a place that is cleaned but not lived in. I took a step forward. The floorboard beneath my slipper groaned, a sharp accusation in the quiet. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I listened for the sound of Elias' footsteps, the heavy tread of his boots on the marble stairs, but there was nothing. Just the clock. Thud-thud. I pulled the key from my pocket. In the dim light filtering through the heavy drapes at the end of the hall, the iron looked black, almost hungry. My hand trembled as I raised it to the lock. The keyhole looked like a wound in the wood. Why did I hesitate? Was it fear of Elias? Or was it the fear that he was right? Perhaps opening this door would unleash the torrent of sorrow I had spent 36 months damming up behind a wall of sedatives and social engagements. I inserted the key. The metal scraped against metal, a harsh, grinding screech that sounded deafening in the stillness. I held my breath. I turned it. The resistance was stiff, the mechanism unused for years. With a sharp clack, the bolt slid back. I expected the air inside to be stagnant. I expected the smell of 3 years of accumulated dust, the musty odor of dry rot, the suffocating atmosphere of a tomb sealed against the world. I expected to see the crib draped in a sheet, a ghostly silhouette of the life that had been stolen from us. I steeled myself for the decay. I pushed the heavy oak door open. It didn't creak. It swung inward silently on well-oiled hinges. The first thing that hit me was the temperature. A draft of cold, conditioned air washed over my face, causing the fine hairs on my arms to stand up. It was distinct from the hallway, crisp, circulated, alive. Then came the smell. It wasn't dust, it wasn't rot. It was an overwhelming, sickly sweet wave of floral perfume. Lilacs, white lilacs. The scent was so thick, so concentrated, it was almost cloying, coating the back of my throat with the taste of spring. I stepped across the threshold, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. The room was not a tomb, it was a shrine. A single shaft of afternoon light cut through a gap in the velvet curtains, illuminating a scene of impossible perfection. There were no dust motes dancing in the light. The surfaces of the mahogany dresser gleamed, free of even a speck of gray. The rocking chair in the corner, the one I had spent countless nights in, nursing Clara, was positioned exactly as I remembered, but the cushion was not flattened or dusty. It was fluffed, plump, and inviting. I walked toward the center of the room, my legs feeling heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. The crib stood in the middle of the floor. It was not covered. The bedding was not yellowed with age. The linens were crisp, blindingly white, and pressed with military precision. They looked freshly laundered, as if they had been changed that very morning. And there, resting in the center of the mattress, right where my daughter's head should have been, lay a bouquet. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the petals. They were white lilacs, lush and vibrant. I touched one. It was cool and wet. A single droplet of dew transferred to my fingertip. They were not plastic. They were not dried relics from the funeral. They were alive, freshly cut. I looked closer. The stems were bound together with a ribbon, not a standard florist's tie, but a thick, distinct length of sapphire velvet. The knot was intricate, a perfect double bow, the ends cut at a precise 45-degree angle. My breath hitched in my throat. This room had been forbidden for 3 years. Elias swore he had the only key. He swore that no one, not even the cleaning staff, was permitted to cross this threshold. He told me the air inside was poison. But looking at the pristine sheets and the weeping flowers, the terrifying truth settled over me like a shroud. There was no dust. The hinges were oiled. The flowers were fresh. Someone hadn't just been preserving this room, they were visiting it. Someone had stood right where I was standing, perhaps only hours ago, smoothing these sheets and placing these flowers. If Elias had the only key, and I had just stolen it from his coat, then how did they get in? I locked the nursery door with shaking hands, the click of the bolt echoing like a gunshot in the silent hallway. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, closing my eyes, willing my breathing to slow. In, out, in, out. I couldn't confront Elias. Not yet. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He would look at me with those pitying eyes, his voice dropping to that soothing, patronizing baritone he used when my nerves were frayed. He would tell me I was hallucinating. He would say the stress was getting to me again, that grief was playing tricks on my mind, projecting what I wanted to see onto the empty canvas of a dusty room. He would call Dr. Evans. He would suggest a higher dosage. He would gaslight me until I believed that the fresh flowers and the scent of lilacs were nothing more than the phantoms of a broken mother. No, I needed proof, tangible, undeniable proof. I looked down at my hand. I had taken the ribbon. It was a strip of sapphire velvet, plush and soft against my skin. It wasn't the cheap satin ribbon you buy at a craft store. This was heavy, luxurious fabric. I ran my thumb over the weave. It was distinct. I recognized the texture, the deep, rich dye. This was the signature wrapping of Florist, the florist in the village, the only shop in 50 miles that imported their ribbons from France. A memory clawed its way to the surface, unbidden and sharp. 3 years ago, the hospital. The fluorescent lights were humming, a low, persistent buzz that drilled into my skull. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. I was standing in the corridor, my body numb, feeling as though I had been hollowed out with a scoop. The doctor stood before me, his face obscured by a surgical mask, his eyes kind but detached. He was moving his mouth, saying words like sudden infant death syndrome and painless and passed in her sleep, but the words felt like they were coming from underwater. I had lunged forward. I needed to see her. I needed to hold my baby one last time. I needed to verify the impossible reality they were trying to force upon me. No, Martha. Elias' hands were on my shoulders, heavy and immovable. He wasn't crying. His face was set in a mask of grim determination. He held me back, his grip bruising. "Let me go, Elias, I need to see her." I had screamed, the sound tearing at my throat. "Remember her as she was, Martha," he whispered, his voice like steel wrapped in wool. "Don't look at the ruin, it will haunt you. I am protecting you." He had been so strong, so controlling in his grief. He had handled everything. The paperwork, the arrangements, the cremation. The cremation. I stood there in the dark hallway of my home, the velvet ribbon twisting around my finger like a constrictor snake. I realized, with a jolt of nausea that nearly brought me to my knees, that I had never seen the ashes. Elias had told me he scattered them in the ocean, at a spot we used to visit when we were dating. He said it was too painful for me to come along. He said he wanted to spare me the finality of it. I never saw a body. I never saw an urn. I never even saw a death certificate. I had simply trusted him because he was my husband, because he was the rock. The trust crumbled in that moment, turning to dust in my mouth. I pocketed the key and the ribbon. I moved quickly now, fueled by a cold, sharp clarity. I grabbed my purse and keys from the foyer table. The drive to the village was a blur of gray asphalt and green hedgerows. I rehearsed my lines in the rearview mirror. I had to be Martha the wife, Martha the socialite, not Martha the woman on the verge of a breakdown. Florist was a burst of color in the dreary town square. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as I entered, a jarring sound against the storm brewing inside me. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and roses, the smell of weddings and funerals. The owner, Mrs. Higgins, was behind the counter arranging a spray of carnations. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp, bird-like eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is a surprise. Usually Mr. Blackwood handles the orders." I forced a smile. It felt brittle on my face. "Yes, well, Elias is terribly busy with the estate accounts this week. I thought I'd save him the trip and settle our monthly bill." She nodded, pulling a ledger from under the counter. She opened it, running a finger down the column. "Of course, dear, Mr. Blackwood is very consistent. Like clockwork he is." My heart rate spiked. "Is he?" "Every Tuesday," she said, tapping the page. "A large bouquet of white lilacs, always the same, for the little one's grave," he says. "It's so touching, really, most men. Well, they forget after a year or so, but not him." I gripped the edge of the counter to keep my hands steady. "Yes, he is very devoted." Mrs. Higgins paused. She looked up from the ledger, her expression shifting. She leaned over the counter slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Although, it is strange, isn't it?" "What is?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Well," she said, frowning slightly, "he never takes the road toward the cemetery, dear." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Excuse me." "I watch him leave," she said, gesturing to the window. "My shop faces the junction. To get to the churchyard, you turn left. Mr. Blackwood always turns right, toward the old logging road." "The logging road," I repeated, the blood draining from my face. "Yes, he drives up toward the old gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of your estate. I always assumed well, maybe he likes to have a private moment before going to the grave, but he stays up there for hours." The cottage. I knew the place. It was a small stone structure deep in the woods, built for the groundskeeper a century ago. It had been abandoned since I moved in. Elias told me the roof had caved in, that it was dangerous, infested with rats. He said it was boarded up. He lied. I stared at Mrs. Higgins, her face swimming in my vision. "Thank you," I managed to choke out. I didn't know that." I turned and walked out of the shop, the bell chiming its mockery behind me. I sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. He wasn't visiting a grave. The nursery wasn't just a shrine, it was a staging ground. The clothes, the sheets, the care. It wasn't for a memory. It was for something or someone that was still here. I looked toward the tree line where the estate woods began. The trees were dense and dark, swallowing the light. Somewhere in there, in a cottage that was supposed to be a ruin, my husband was hiding the truth. And I was going to find it. The sky broke open just after dusk. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a punishment. The wind howled through the valley, stripping the leaves from the oaks and driving the water against the manor windows with the sound of thrown gravel. Elias had left an hour ago. "Business," he had said, smoothing his tie in the hallway mirror, not meeting my eyes. "Don't wait up, Martha. The storm might keep me in town." He had kissed my cheek, his lips cold and dry like parchment. I waited until his taillights disappeared down the drive, swallowed by the deluge. Then, I didn't go to bed. I went to the mudroom. I pulled on my heavy rubber boots and grabbed the heavy industrial flashlight we kept for power outages. The walk to the edge of the estate was a nightmare. The ground, usually solid earth, had turned into a slurry of sucking mud that grabbed at my ankles with every step. The wind tore at my raincoat, trying to push me back. As if the land itself was conspiring with Elias to keep me from the truth. Branches whipped against my face, leaving stinging welts, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The image of the fresh lilacs burned in my mind, brighter than the lightning that flashed overhead. I reached the tree line where the forest grew dense. The path to the gamekeeper's cottage was overgrown, choked with briars and nettles. Elias had told me for 10 years that this place was a ruin, a rotting husk of timber and stone, unsafe for habitation. But as I broke through the final thicket, shielding my eyes against the stinging rain, I didn't see a ruin. I saw a lighthouse in the abyss. The cottage stood intact, its stone walls solid against the storm. And there, shining from the downstairs window, was a glow. It wasn't the flicker of a squatter's fire. It was the steady, warm amber of an electric lamp. Smoke, the smell of burning birch wood, was being whipped away from the chimney by the gale. My heart slammed against my ribs, hard enough to hurt. I killed the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness, and crept toward the light. The mud silenced my footsteps. I moved like a ghost, a specter haunting my own land. I reached the window. The glass was beaded with rain and condensation. I raised a trembling hand and wiped a circle clean. The scene inside was so aggressively normal, so violently domestic, that my brain refused to process it for a full second. A fire crackled in the hearth. There was a braided rug on the floor, and in the rocking chair, a duplicate of the one in my nursery, sat a woman. She was humming, her head bent low over a bundle in her arms. She turned her profile to the window, and the breath left my lungs in a sharp, agonizing wheeze. It was Sarah, my sister, my own flesh and blood, whom I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. She wasn't in Paris. She wasn't living the high life she wrote about in her infrequent, cold letters. She was here, in my woods. And then, the bundle in her arms moved. Sarah shifted, lifting the child to her shoulder to burp her. The world stopped. The rain, the wind, the cold, it all vanished. It was a toddler, a girl. She had a shock of dark curls and skin like porcelain. As she turned her head, the firelight caught her face. I saw the distinctive cleft in her chin, Elias' chin, and then her eyes, wide, dark, and shaped exactly like mine. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a memory. It was Clara. She was bigger, older, but I knew her. A mother knows the map of her child's face better than her own soul. She wasn't dead. She wasn't ashes in the ocean. She was alive. A primal sound ripped through me, a scream that didn't sound human. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I lunged at the door. It was locked, but the wood was old and I was possessed by the strength of pure, unadulterated madness. I threw my shoulder against it. The lock splintered. The door flew open, banging against the interior wall with a crash that shook the room. "Martha!" Sarah screamed, clutching the child to her chest, scrambling backward in the chair. Her eyes went wide with terror, not shame. "Give her to me," I shrieked, water dripping from my hair, my hands clawed like talons. "Give me my daughter." I took a step forward, ready to tear the world apart to get to her. "Stay back." The voice came from the shadows of the kitchen, low, dangerous. Elias stepped into the firelight. He wasn't wearing his coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, holding a mug of tea. He looked at me, and his expression wasn't one of guilt. It wasn't fear. He looked furious. He dropped the mug. It shattered on the stone floor, the ceramic shards skittering across the rug. He stepped between me and Sarah, his body a wall. "You weren't supposed to know," he snarled, his voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "You told me she died," I screamed, the words tearing at my raw throat. "I mourned her. I wanted to die with her. You let me bury an empty box." "You were unstable," Elias countered, shouting over me. His composure cracked, revealing the monster underneath. "Look at you. You're hysterical. You have been since the day she was born." "I was depressed," I sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at the child, my child, who was now wailing in Sarah's arms. "I had postpartum depression. I needed help, not this torture." "You had psychosis, Martha," Elias said, his voice dropping to that cold, clinical tone that terrified me more than his shouting. "You were hearing things. You were forgetting where you put her. You were a danger to her, a danger to my heir." He took a step toward me, forcing me back toward the open door and the storm outside. "I did what I had to do to protect my bloodline," he spat. "I couldn't let you ruin her. I couldn't let you break her like you're broken." The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The nursery, the fresh flowers, the pristine sheets. "The lilacs," I whispered, horror rising in my throat like bile. "The room, you kept it ready." "For her," Elias said, nodding toward the child. "Not for you, never for you." He smiled, a cruel thin thing. "The plan was simple, Martha. We were just waiting for you to finally snap, to finally prove to the doctors that you belonged in a facility permanently. And once you were gone, locked away where you couldn't hurt anyone, I was going to bring her home, my niece, adopted by a grieving father." He looked at Sarah, then back at me. "But you always were too inquisitive for your own good, weren't you, Martha? You just couldn't leave the door closed." The wind howled through the broken door behind me. I looked at Clara, crying in the arms of the woman who stole her. I looked at my husband, the architect of my hell. I was alone. I was trapped. And the man standing in front of me had already killed me once. He wouldn't hesitate to do it again to keep his secret. He reached into his pocket. "You're not well, Martha," he said softly, pulling out his phone. "I think it's time I made that call to Dr. Evans. You're having an episode. You're seeing dead children in the woods." He took a step closer, his eyes dead and cold. "Who is going to believe you?" he asked. "The crazy woman in the storm, or the grieving husband who has tried everything to save her?" The end of my marriage did not sound like a scream, or a gunshot, or a breaking plate. It sounded like the crackle of a police radio, and the rhythmic, splashing crunch of heavy tires on a gravel driveway turned to mud. I stood on the front porch of the manor, shivering under a blanket an officer had draped over my shoulders. The storm had finally broken, reducing itself to a steady, weeping drizzle that slicked the world in gray. But the darkness was gone. The estate was awash in a chaotic, strobing sea of blue and red light. The rotating bars of the patrol cars painted the ancient oaks in violent, alternating colors, exposing the secrets hidden in the shadows for centuries. I hadn't fought Elias in the cottage. I knew I couldn't win a physical war against a man who had already buried me alive in my own grief. When he reached for his phone to call the doctor, to commit me to the silence of an institution, I had done the one thing he never expected Martha, the victim, to do. I ran. I fled into the dark, tangled woods, blindly tearing through the briars until I reached the main road and flagged down a passing delivery truck. I didn't call the doctor, I called the sheriff, and I didn't speak of ghosts, I spoke of kidnapping. Now, I watched the finale of his grand performance. 2 officers led Elias out of the cottage woods. He was not the composed, untouchable patriarch who ruled the county. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive linen shirt clinging to his chest, his hair plastered to his skull. His wrists were bound behind his back in steel cuffs that glinted under the strobe lights. He was still shouting. Even now, with the game board overturned, he tried to move the pieces. "She is unwell," his voice boomed, though it cracked with a desperation I had never heard before. He twisted his head to look at the sheriff. "My wife has a history of severe psychosis. This is a delusion. She is hallucinating a child to replace the one we lost. You are traumatizing a grieving family based on the word of a madwoman." The sheriff, a man Elias had invited to our Christmas parties for a decade, didn't look at him. He looked past him, toward the cottage door where a female officer was emerging. In her arms, wrapped in a thermal emergency blanket, was a small, confused toddler. "I don't think Mrs. Blackwood is hallucinating, Elias," the sheriff said, his voice flat and heavy with disgust. "Unless we're all hallucinating the kid." Elias went silent. His eyes found mine across the wet lawn. In them I saw no remorse. I saw only the fury of a god whose creation had dared to defy him. He didn't see a child, he saw a failed asset. He didn't see a wife, he saw a broken tool. As they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, he didn't look back at the daughter he had stolen. He looked at the house. He looked at his legacy, wondering who would polish the silver now. Sarah was led out next. She was weeping, her face buried in her hands, unable to meet my gaze. I felt nothing for her. My anger had burned so hot it had turned into ash, leaving me cold and empty. Hours later, after the statements were taken and the social services vehicle had arrived, I walked back upstairs. The house was quiet again, but the silence had changed. The oppressive weight, that feeling of being watched by the walls, had evaporated. I walked down the east wing corridor. The door to the nursery stood open, just as I had left it. I stepped inside. The room was technically a crime scene, though the police had finished their work here. The vase on the dresser was empty. They had bagged the fresh lilacs as evidence, proof of premeditation, proof of the shrine that was actually a waiting room. Without the flowers, the room smelled different. The sickly sweet, cloying scent of lilacs was fading, replaced by the smell of wet earth from my boots and the stale, sterile air of the house. I walked to the crib. It was truly empty now. For 3 years, I had avoided this room because I thought it contained the ghost of my dead child. I thought it was a tomb. I had stood outside this door, pressing my ear to the wood, torturing myself with the idea that my grief was the only thing keeping her memory alive. But it wasn't a tomb. It was a staging ground. It was a monument to my husband's God complex. He had kept this room perfect not out of reverence for the dead, but out of arrogance for the living. He had kept it warm for the day he would successfully dispose of me and install his new family in my home, like changing a painting on the wall. I looked down at my hand. I was still clutching the sapphire velvet ribbon I had taken from the bouquet. It was crushed now, stained with the mud from my escape. I realized then that Elias was right about one thing. The Martha who lived in this house for the last 3 years was dead. He had killed her with his lies, but the woman standing here now, she was something else entirely. She was the one who survived. I walked to the window. Down below, the taillights of the social worker's sedan were fatting down the driveway. They were taking Clara to a temporary foster home until the DNA tests confirmed what my heart already knew. It would be a long road. There would be lawyers, courts, media circuses, and the slow, painful process of unearthing every lie Elias had planted in the soil of our marriage. But as I watched the red lights disappear into the night, I didn't feel despair. I felt a fierce, burning patience. I would get her back. I would rebuild. I turned away from the window. I walked out of the nursery, stepping into the hallway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy iron skeleton key, the key that had been forbidden, the key that unlocked the horror. I held it for a moment, feeling its cold weight. Then I opened my hand. The key hit the floorboards with a dull thud. I didn't pick it up. I didn't close the nursery door. I left it wide open, letting the draft from the hallway blow through the room, chasing away the last lingering scent of the flowers. I won't need to lock the doors anymore. The monster isn't in the basement or in the attic or under the bed. The monster is in a cell, and the secrets are out. Unlike the flowers, the truth won't wilt. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library, waiting for you.